All right, so can you hear me okay? Yeah, cool. So this is joint work with Rubin. My name is Murat, I'm from Reserve Bank, so Rubin is here, my colleague. So usual disclaimer of course applies. So these views here are, they belong to us and they don't represent the views of the Reserve Bank of New Zealand. All right, so let's get started. So what's our motivation? So as of 1st of April 2019, there's a new monetary policy remit for the RBNZ. So it specifies the overarching goals of MPC here. So maintaining a stable general level of price over the medium term and supporting maximum sustainable employment. So this inclusion of this second phrase here, the supporting maximum sustainable employment, makes this remit dual mandate. So it's the common name given to this kind of a remit that has some reference to a resource utilization measure on the top of inflation targeting. So that's what we mean by dual mandate. So the introduction of this reference to maximum sustainable employment kind of moved RBNZ to the same league of central banks like Fed and RBA who do dual mandate. Okay, so what is our motivation in this paper? So our motivation is the following. So what are the welfare implications of a dual mandate for monetary policy in a small open economy model? So to translate this kind of an academic phrase to a more, daily language, so is the central bank response to measures of economic activity welfare enhancing? So this is the question we are asking. And we take a structural modeling approach to address this question because it's almost impossible to do real-life experiments in these issues. So one way to approach this could be natural experiments that switch from policy A to B, or A to B, which is already a hard effort, but what about policies that are counterfactual? So there's no way to experiment with this. So that's one thing. That's why we have structural models in general. And it's hard to measure social welfare in reality, so that's another issue. So to run these experiments about alternative monetary policies, our lab environment is a small open economy DSG model with unemployment. So this model builds around, so we didn't pick this out of blue or out of thin air, so it's builds around the workhorse model, so for monetary policy analysis used in many prominent central banks. So we take bits and pieces of this huge literature and build a small open economy model. One thing we do differently, kind of something you don't see in these models very often, is to model unemployment and employment explicitly. Then the rest is standard small open economic features that you see in other central bank models. So our question is basically, okay, so we have this workhorse model that's used by central banks, but what does this model say about dual mandate from a welfare perspective? Okay, so this is our exercise. So I'm gonna talk about the main results in the beginning. So response to resource utilization, so dual mandate, increases social welfare, that's what we find. And this effect is greater when the inflation response is muted. And if the central bank is very rigorous with inflation targeter, then we find that welfare gains from responding to resource utilization is not that big. So this leads us to conclude that inflation targeting is still a very attractive policy, given that there's a lot of uncertainty around resource utilization gap measures. And we also, our exercise answers which measure of resource utilization is better from a welfare sense, and we find that responding to employment rate or unemployment rate gaps leads to superior welfare outcomes than responding to another resource utilization measure like output gap. Okay, and finally, we document a particular case against dual mandate, and that case is the existence of powerful cost push shocks. So I'm going to talk about these later on at the end. But as I said, so we built on an existing literature. So the paper that inspired this work that we are doing actually back in, I think, 2018, when we were trying to do a conference on future of inflation targeting, we were looking for, what's going on in the literature, and we saw this paper in the working paper stage, this paper by De Bartoli, Kim, Linda, and Nunes, where they were studying dual mandate for the US and investigative welfare enhancing. So we said, okay, so let's do the same for similar work for New Zealand. But then we took a kind of a different approach, because their paper looks at this question. I'm not going to go into the details, but from a more theoretical perspective, and we ended up using an alternative strategy and looked at simple implementable policy rules from a more practical point of view. I'm going to talk about this later on, but again, I mean, we borrow from existing literature in this model, especially in small open economic features from these papers you see here. And we modeled unemployment in the spirit of Gali. Okay. One important thing is that we analyze monetary policy design using a non-linear environment. So we try to do a rigorous job assessing these welfare implications in a proper way. Okay, so I'm not going to go into the model details because it's going to take forever, and I invite you to read our 68-page technical appendix if you are interested. Okay, so but this picture will summarize our model at a glance. Okay, so we have rest of the world on the right-hand side. On the left-hand side, we have the domestic market. We have importing firms that import from abroad at world price, P star. Then these imported goods go to domestic markets and become consumption or investment goods, and they are either consumed by the households or add to the, as imported investment good, add to the capital stock. And households, they rent these factors to the domestic firm, this yellow one, and domestic firm sells them goods in the goods market, and also exports to rest of the world. So this is more or less the broad mechanism. There are many bells and whistles details, but we can't go through them here. So, and then we have financial markets in a really kind of a simple way. So we have domestic central bank, rest of the world central bank setting interest rates, and in the markets, foreign currency and domestic currency denominated bonds are traded and consumed by households. Okay, so the monetary policy in this model is, so we investigate Taylor type rules, policy rules. So this first part here, so central bank responds to macro developments by moving the nominal policy rate from its neutral level. According to this rule, there's some interest rate inertia, sorry. And the second term here is the inflation targeting term. So when expected inflation deviates from its target or long run level, then central bank intervenes. This pink one here is how we introduce the dual mandate. Okay. So this is our measure of resource utilization. So if Rx is 0, then it means that, if its coefficient is 0, it means that we don't have dual mandate, so we are back in inflation targeting world. Okay, and we consider 3 measures of resource utilization: output gap, employment gap, and unemployment gap inverted. So this is our monetary policy. It's a Taylor rule with dual mandate. Okay, then we investigate a set of simple and implementable policy rules. So we're gonna construct a grid over plausible values of these coefficients. So RP in this range, Rx in that range, and we're gonna fix the inertia term and play with it in the sensitivity analysis later on. So we consider a grid script P over this, and solve the model and calculate welfare implications along the grid under each measure of resource utilization, and compare these from a welfare perspective. So the last slide with equations, but I'm going to go a bit slower here because This is our welfare metric, and this is a welfare paper, so it's kind of important. So in this model, social welfare is measured by lifetime utility of the representative agent, okay, expected lifetime utility. So the utility in this model, pretty standard, depends on habit-corrected consumption and employment. So that's our welfare measure. Then, because welfare in these models, in all the economics, it's ordinal, so we need to quantify this to really be able to compare. So that's why we compute Hicksian compensation variations, which I call lambda here, and compare it to a reference welfare economy, and a welfare in a reference economy. So in these models, the good thing is that whatever policy we do, all the tweaks we do, these models share a common nested place, which is called flexible price economy. So we're going to take that as a reference point, which doesn't matter really, but it's great because it's the same for all of our policies. So it's going to be our benchmark economy, this one. So we're going to compare against this, all the policies, so that they are comparable with each other as well, because we compare them to the same reference economy. Okay, so it's easier said than done, though, because this calculating this lambda is, gets out of hand quite easily. It's very complicated because you need to come up with one number in an infinite time horizon and across all the states in the world. That's why you have an expectation term here. So this basically tells us that in this frictionless economy, where welfare is higher because there are no distortions and there's no room for policy, so the welfare in the benchmark economy is in this perfect world, which is kind of a theoretical concept. So we measure by this lambda, the pink guy there. So what we measure by that is that how much we need to compensate the agents in this economy under the policies we investigate so that they are indifferent between being in this economy and in the benchmark economy. Okay, so that's what lambda is. So if we need to compensate this agent here a lot, it means that the welfare in our policy is really bad because we need to give them a lot of resources so that they are indifferent. And on the opposite, so if the lambda is really low, it means that welfare in the policy world is really high so that we don't need to compensate these agents a lot to be in the perfect world. So long story short, high lambda means low welfare. Low lambda means high welfare. So it's kind of, it might be hard to follow, but bear with me. So then we look at conditional, unconditional welfare here. So we take the expectations. So you have those expectation terms without subscript T. So that's going to be our welfare measure. So we're going to calculate this lambda guy for each point in the grid and compare. Okay? So that's why consumption and depend on the policy, because they will vary according to the policy that we consider. Okay, so this is the welfare metric. So our main results. So this first picture on the very left summarizes our first and last result. So response to resource utilization increases social welfare. So in the vertical axis, you have this lambda here, the compensating variation, Hicksian compensating variation. And on the horizontal axis, you have response coefficient to the resource utilization. Okay? And the red one is the reaction to output gap, blue one is the unemployment rate gap, and the green one is the employment gap. So what this tells us that, remember, higher lambda means lower welfare, and lower lambda means higher welfare. So when the coefficient of resource utilization increases from 0 to 2.5, these guys slope down, meaning that welfare increases. Okay? So dual mandate increases welfare, and this is for a fixed fixed level of inflation response. So the central bank is responding to inflation, but not aggressively. Okay, so it's really a muted response. In this case, welfare gains are large, and this is our first and second result. And the last result is in the same picture as well. So when the central bank responds to when the resource utilization measure is employment rate, actually that gives you the, in terms of, when we talk in relative terms, it gives you the worst, a kind of an inferior outcome than responding to employment gap and unemployment gap. Okay, and when we draw these graphs again, for a central bank that responds to inflation more aggressively, then these welfare gains are still there, so they still slope down until some point at least. But now the welfare gains are much smaller. And when we have a really rigorous inflation targeting, then those gains are really, really small. Okay, and given, then we reach our conclusion that inflation targeting is still an attractive policy because targeting these resource gaps is not easy. There's a lot of uncertainty. They are not directly measurable like inflation rate. So these are main results. So this is a three-dimensional representation of the same results. So you may want to look at the paper if you are interested in that. So then we undertake a comprehensive set of sensitivity analysis and find that our qualitative results remain the same. Although there are some changes in the quantitative results, main results carry over. And these are the list of sensitivity analysis that we do. So we play with the endogenous frictions, full versus zero indexation. We kill habit persistence, kill investment adjustment costs, consider low versus high openness, lower price, wage adjustment costs, extreme interest rate inertia, etc. But our qualitative results stay the same. So the same is true for demand-side disturbances, like shocks to consumption, investment, exogenous spending. Still, we have the same qualitative results. And when we play with the shock sizes on production, be it permanent or transitory, our results stay the same. But there's one case against dual mandate that we document, and it's powerful cost push shocks. And in this case, we find that if these cost push shocks, markup shocks, are really terrible, that if they are big, then dual mandate might be harmful. That's what our analysis indicate. And this intuition here is, we think, is similar to Monkey or others. I've seen other papers too. So powerful markup shocks kind of puts the central bank in a dilemma because let's say there's a bad shock, it puts pressure on the inflation, but also it creates a negative output gap. So central bank, when it tries to respond to inflationary pressures, it worsens the other concern, output gap, and vice versa. So it faces this dilemma. And in our case, when central bank, in the face of these big cost push shocks, if central bank tries to respond to stabilizing resource utilization, the trade-off works in a way that it dominates and at the end ends up in a bad welfare outcome. Okay, and this trade-off, this kind of a trade-off doesn't exist, so that's the divine coincidence result for demand shocks or efficient supply shocks. So when you respond to inflation, it's okay. You also stabilize your output. Okay, so we find that, again, this kind of a perverse case for powerful cost push shocks, which monetary economists realize that they lead to a lot of problems about monetary policy, and it shows up here too. Okay, so this is the graphical representation of this result. So in this case, lambda increases with response coefficient to resource utilization, which means that this dual mandate in this case doesn't make much sense. And the 3D representation. So I'm going to conclude by repeating our conclusions. So generally, response to resource utilization increases social welfare, and this is especially the case if central bank response to inflation is not very aggressive. And of course, reverse is true. That makes inflation targeting an attractive policy still, given the uncertainty about resource utilization measures. So this is not we are not the first to make this point. So Orphanides Northern, for example, realized this similar conclusion. And in terms of which resource utilization measure, we find that employment rate or unemployment rate gaps leads to better outcomes. And finally, there's this particular case against dual mandate, which is powerful cost-push shocks. Thanks for your attention. Thank you.
So Dennis has popped down from Otago University. So yeah, thanks a lot for coming along, Dennis, and the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks. No, first of all, congratulations to the organizers. I think having this workshop, although I only see half of it, I apologize. I think it's a great way to do. We should have more of this, especially getting us academics out of the ivory tower. I think is usually appreciated. Now, I'm going to discuss the paper. Obviously, very quickly, what's this paper about? So we'll take a kind of off-the-shelf New Keynesian small open economy DSGE model with 12 shocks that drive the dynamics here, but we add unemployment to it. So sounds straightforward, and I did read the 68-page appendix because you sent it to me. It's just not, right? It's a very complicated, very large model with a lot of assumptions, with a lot of detail, so it is not a straightforward exercise. Unemployment here modeled in the spirit of Gali, which is pretty much the Erdtek et al. Paper way of motivating unemployment. The idea is you have agents and they are monopolistically competitive, so they can set a wage above market clearing, so you get unemployment. Okay. And then looking at welfare implications of targeting the output gap, unemployment gap, employment gap in I would say standard Taylor rule. Right? We can talk about that later. And the finding is pretty much, okay, if you're inflation targeting, any weight on whatever output gap, whatever gap you want to have is going to be welfare improving. Okay, so that's the second to last bullet point. And to me, the interesting bit was if you increase the inflation targeting aspect of it, the differences between targeting these different gaps goes away. Okay, and I think that to me is the interesting takeaway. Now, I'm going to do not a nitty-gritty discussion of every little detail. I think more about the big picture here. And the first point that I'm not quite clear about is why not going to a more established way of modeling labor market frictions? Okay, and why is that important? Well, I think that is important because there are different things going on within the labor market. This is data from New Zealand, and it shows the beverage curve over time. Now, the idea of this is if the beverage curve moves, the labor market changes. And here we see that match efficiency, which changes these beverage curves here, is changing in New Zealand. So that's something that's only captured by labor supply shocks. If we believe that there are other shocks in the labor market and that monetary policy should respond differently to these types of shocks, then that can lead to different welfare implications. So that basically opens up to the modeling of the labor market. Participation rate is in there. It can also be in a search and matching model, right? We know that. Taylor rule. Okay, now this is kind of Pandora's box of monetary DSGE modeling. How do you specify it? And there is no answer. There is just clever referees who always point out you can do something differently. And me pointing out something differently is an argument that goes back to Gali, because Gali argued, I don't know, 10 years or so that, well, instead of having the output gap, maybe unemployment and or unemployment gap could be interesting because unemployment has different information than the output gap. Think about a jobless recovery where Y responds immediately, but unemployment is kind of sluggish. So maybe you want to think about a kind of lead-lag structure that, again, in the theoretical model, can lead to different outcomes. I'm going to leave it at that. Calibration obviously is an issue because we're mixing papers that we take the parameters from. So different time frames, different methods, can we really be sure that some of these parameters, and I'm not talking about capital depreciation, right? Some of the crucial parameters, how certain are we that we got them pinned down correctly? And especially with just one parameter that matters in the labor market, how much are we really saying about the labor market? So from the motivation of the paper, if we have a dual mandate, should we have something else in the Taylor rule other than inflation? To me, the intuitive answer was, well, of course, right? If you think about a central bank loss function in the Woodford, Swenson style, then you have the variance of output, you have the variance of inflation. If you just have one instrument, you're not going to be first best, right? That's just straightforward. So the interesting bit to me, again, was this welfare gain stuff. Just copy-paste here. And looking at the level sets here is the interesting bit that the difference between those targeting, whether I'm targeting an output gap, employment gap, unemployment gap, goes away if I increase my inflation targeting. So if I would be the policymaker, I would say, well, okay, then just increase the weight in the Taylor rule on inflation, then I don't have to worry about is it output gap, unemployment gap, and so on. Just pick one of them, and let's take the output gap because it's kind of established, and I don't have to worry about anything else anymore. So that was my policy takeaway from the paper. I would like to see if there are stabilization trade-offs. Is it that the welfare maximizing rule creates trade-offs between volatility stabilization? Is the labor market becoming more or less volatile relative to, let's say, output, consumption, and so on? Plot correlations. And what's the optimal simple rule? If we can think about, or put differently, what's the global welfare maximization point here? That's something that I think would be interesting to see. Various extensions that I think could be relevant, not going to go through all of them, that's just, you already have the slides. Especially I would be interested in the zero lower bound and the wage rigidity. I haven't seen a paper doing all of this plus wage rigidity, and my thinking is it will matter big time, because the wage will change, that affects the labor supply schedule, and that could affect the welfare computation. So that's something that I think would be interesting. And I think as a referee or discussant, you have to point out how to do it. Klaus Lubig have a paper quite straightforward to implement. Lastly, I thought it would be interesting to ask the other question. If we have a labor market reform and the government's, the FPA or whatever it is called, that's going to be a labor market reform. What's the effect of different monetary policy targeting rules on that? So I went back to an old paper and did this quick and dirty. The takeaway is it really matters. I was surprised. I thought this would all be the same and nothing matters. But it really matters for welfare. This is welfare numbers, the same numbers we've seen before, how you target, how you classify your Taylor rules. So if you have a labor market shock, labor market reform shock, then the way you specify your Taylor rule can help in increasing welfare. So that was something that I didn't quite expect, and I'm going to leave it at that. Thanks.
So maybe before we collect questions, is there anything you want to respond to in terms of Dennis's comments?
So, Dennis, thank you so much. It was a great discussion, great points, so well taken. You probably know that I'm a big fan of search and matching models, so that's the way to go, definitely. But we had other constraints like time, resource constraints, that this was the easier way to do. About the calibration, we went for a nonlinear approach. So we didn't estimate the model at this stage, but that's something we're going to do, at least part of the parameters. In the future, we are planning to do a simulated method of moments. With that, so we ended up calibrating the model, but we do a really extensive sensitivity analysis so that we cover all the grounds. Yeah.
Can I add a couple of points? So one, the main source of difficulty is that small open economy models are not small. No, exactly. They're very big. Yeah. The name is a misguiding. So we need something tractable. Given the complexity of the rest of the real economy, we need something tractable to work with the labor market. And so we need something tractable to work with the labor market. So and the Gully specification is extremely simple, and it does not add extra parameters for us to work with. Whereas the search and matching model, there are many search and matching models, many types of search and matching models. It's not unique. And there is not one that has captured the imagination of the world. So whereas Gully it's the simplest way of doing it. And that is the main reason. And the specification of unemployment relies on wage rigidity. If there was no wage rigidity, there wouldn't be unemployment. So one of the points that you made, I didn't really understand about Krauss and Lubick. Your point about volatility stabilization is well taken. We have to find out what happens to volatilities when we change the response coefficients. What else was the...
Yeah, I mean, in general, it's a good habit to, in this literature at least, to report second moments. So we should, definitely do that.
But the overall qualitative flavor of the results, we are very confident because we've changed everything possible, all kinds of parameter combinations. So the qualitative results, we're pretty sure will remain intact. The quantitative side will change. Yeah. But at the end of the day, welfare is ordinal. Right, yeah.
If we went, David Tripe from Massey University. If we went back 35 years, roughly, when we started talking about inflation targeting in this country, we had inflation rates that were very much higher. And there was a lot of talk at that time about how important a single target was. And I think there's a very interesting point that you make towards the end of your paper, and I think you could bring in some of the historical context about how completely different the environment is now in terms of the concerns about inflation and cost push, because cost push was a very big thing in the 80s.
Sure.
And I think,
shock.
So I think there's a very practical point that you could bring in there and give it some very real motivation and meaning in terms of the different economic environment.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, I'm Michael Gordon from Westpac. One of your points towards the end was the sort of more gains from focusing on the unemployment rate than the output gap, which I very much agree with. And I guess furthermore to that, I mean, output gaps are really tough to calculate, and what you calculate in real time can end up being quite different from what they look like after the fact. So I suppose in terms of your work, I wasn't sure if when you model it, is it sort of trying to capture a real-time output gap estimate, or is it hindsight?
Well, in this theoretical model, that endpoint problem you are talking about is not an issue, but our practical conclusion actually thinks about that, So that's our underlying thinking, that measuring unemployment rate gaps or output gaps, all of these resource utilization gaps are hard, and there's a lot of uncertainty around it. So inflation targeting seems to be a cleaner way to...
One way to address your point would be saying that the observed output gap is the actual plus the measurement error. So we can do it within the context of the model. It's possible to do that. Yeah.
Thanks.
Murat, thank you very much. Is that on? I can't tell. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. This is very worthwhile and important work, and I'd be interested to see how your paper compares with the same sort of research that went into designing the reform of the Act in December 2018. But I suspect this is that sort of modelling probably wasn't available. Going back to David's point, And in some respects, the original Act and the original way in which cost shocks were handled was under the original Act, there was a policy targets agreement, and with the single mandate, these issues were anticipated by having provisions in the policy targets agreement to be able to look through the cost shocks. And so they specified cost shocks, and in many respects they anticipated these sorts of issues, these trade-offs. So it was quite a clever design of implementing the requirements of the Act, and those issues were reflected in Gertler, the Science of Monetary Policy paper in 1999. So it's always interested me, the arguments about welfare arguments that motivated the change in the Act in 2018 to make it a dual mandate. So have you thought about comparing the welfare outcome, the welfare results here with another specification which just had a single mandate and then explicitly allowed for ignoring cost shocks? Demand shocks are easy to handle, as you know from the 1999 paper, but cost shocks are where the trade-offs occur. So have you thought about, in dealing with David's point, putting in your paper a different specification and the welfare implications there? The trouble is you've got to be able to define what those cost shocks are. And so you might want to think about that. Thanks.
No, but that's a great point. I mean, it would be a great exercise. We should think about that, definitely.
One part of that is already accounted for in our 3D graph for the cost push shocks, because you have the axis where you just have pure inflation targeting. You have no reaction to the output gap, but you...
I think Bob is saying that, like the previous PTA, if there's explicitly a clause that, that lets you ignore cost push shocks when you respond. Here we don't have that, but I think it can be done, and it would be very interesting, especially, it would make an impact in the monetary policy.
I think people who designed the Act and the PTAs back in the 90s and early 2000s anticipated these issues very clearly. They deserve a lot of credit for it.
I agree. Somebody?
Okay, so are there any more questions? All right, well, let's thank Dennis and Murat once more.